Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me as part of AI Week 2025. This talk is all about how we at Sense About Science are equipping people with the right questions to ask of AI whenever it's being developed and used. And we've done this via a framework that we've developed called the Responsible Handover of AI Framework. Whether you consider yourself an AI expert or completely new to this field, I hope by the end of this talk, you understand the pivotal role responsible handover can play in AI development and feel empowered to formulate your own responsible handover strategy. So just a bit of background into what we do at Sense About Science. We launched amongst the backdrop of intense public debates surrounding science and health stories, such as GMO crops, vaccines, and alternative health treatments. And these topics often led to public scares based off unverified or false information. So our key mission is promoting the public interest in sound science and evidence. And we do this by equipping the public with the right questions to ask of science and establishing whether information they come across is to be trusted or not, such as creating easy to read guides. We run campaigns on how transparent government has been whenever they introduce a new policy. And we also equip scientists to communicate their research more effectively via workshops and guides, such as explaining the peer review process. We ran a campaign called All Trials around 10 years ago, which addressed the growing concern amongst the public that less than half of clinical trials that were performed were not being published. And this was an issue that had been known for some time and had been discussed extensively, but nothing was changing. Drug companies were still refusing to publish all the research they had done on their drugs, and academics had also been guilty of this. And the research that was not being published was often that which would have been the most valuable, such as trials where the drug did not work or cause serious harm. As not all clinical trials were being published, there were several cases where people were taking part in trials which had already been done elsewhere in the world, thus wasting the time and money of all those involved. And the same side effects that had befallen patients in previous trials were happening again and again. We couldn't quite believe that nobody was fixing this. So over the course of 10 years, we, alongside thousands of people and organizations, of which a handful of them are illustrated here, joined the public All Trials campaign, calling for all clinical trials to be published. Trials were not being published, not just for secrecy and withholding bad data, but also that people just didn't really feel the need to because they were under no public pressure and there was no hit to their reputation for when they didn't publish the data. All of the organizations on this list played a crucial role within their own research ecosystem, whether that be patient groups, consumers, health services. They were all able to apply pressure within their own networks. And now flash forward to 2025, it's a legally required mandate for all clinical trials in the UK to be registered in a World Health Organization public register, and for the results to be published within the 12 months of a clinical trial ending. And although we are close to 100% compliance, there is still more work to be done. What the All Trials campaign showed is that people really do care about evidence and ensuring that they're fully able to explore the reasoning behind the decisions affecting their lives. And this public interest in evidence and transparency in decision-making was, of course, extremely prominent during COVID, when models were being used to track how quickly a virus would spread. But people, including the policymakers using these models, did not understand how they worked. So over recent years, there's been a huge surge of public interest in AI because of how it's been introduced into daily life. So now we're seeing headlines such as the ones here nearly every day. Because of the speed of its deployment, we realized around 2018 that there was a serious lack of understanding into what AI and algorithms actually are, the so-called black box issue. A lot of us know what AI can do, but don't know how it does it. As people are unsure how these tools have been developed and what the extent of their use is going to look like in the future, we've ended up in a situation where people are afraid of AI, quote unquote, taking over, and real concerns that AI will be implemented in an unethical manner or cause harm, either being intended or unintended. And part of the problem with AI is the inaccessible language around it. So we created a guide called the Data Science Guide for Society, for it not to be a dictionary of terms, but to help non-data scientists understand enough about the language around AI and algorithms so that they could join a conversation. It puts the language into context by running through simple conceptual examples to demonstrate how AI and algorithm is developed. It then goes on to introduce 3 questions that people can ask of data to understand the level of quality and whether it's good enough to base decisions of. And these 3 questions are: where does it come from? What's being assumed? And can it bear the weight being put on it? And following on from that guide, we created another guide on how to equip people with the right questions when presented with simulation models to make decisions. These models have been used to develop policies that can help mitigate climate change, for example. Despite their increased use, the people using these models were concerned that they were not well equipped to scrutinize how robust these models were and in what situations they should be used. So this guide equips people through a list of questions to help them assess whether a particular model is the right tool to use and how to interpret the results correctly. These questions covered things such as what the unknowns of a model are, how accurate it is, and if there are any other alternatives. And this guide was developed alongside the Joint Research Centre at the European Commission to help members of the European Parliament, citizens, and researchers. And we're delighted that this guidance was officially incorporated into their public platform so that anyone can access it. So thinking about AI and the state of where we're at the moment, I don't need to go into too much detail about the rapid spread of AI and its applications over the past few years. Despite it spreading so rapidly, the governance has not kept up to pace with it. New regulation often comes into play after a new piece of software has been released, so there's often a bit of a grey area whenever AI is developed and deployed. In the UK, the government is attempting to tackle this by ramping up its efforts to regulate AI, and this is similar across the world as well. But it will be a long time before governance is standardized and implemented across all industries. In the meantime, organizations and individuals are continuing to develop and use AI because they have to remain competitive, but they often do this without the due diligence into how these tools can be used properly and what the risks are if something goes wrong. So as AI tools and other technology gets developed and utilized, they go through multiple transfer or handover points. For example, this diagram shows the journey an AI tool to detect skin cancer just by looking at a picture may take. It starts off with a statistician creating the algorithm for grading skin cancer likelihood just by analyzing an image. This tool is then passed on to a researcher who tests the effectiveness of this tool over a larger population and tailors the algorithm based off the feedback they receive. This is then passed on to an app developer who works on commercializing the tool by making a user-friendly interface. And then lastly, the tool ends up in the hands of a doctor who uses the tool in their clinic. At each handover stage, there's vital information about the strengths and weaknesses of a tool that are vulnerable to being lost, as shown in the diagram with the red text. For example, the data used to train the model may be entirely forgotten as the tool is handed over to the app developers and clinicians. For detecting something such as skin cancer, this could be disastrous. As you may expect, the tool performs differently depending on the color of someone's skin. So if the data is lacking input from patients with darker skin, then the tool is essentially pointless to use in a dark population. But if the clinician doesn't know this because they haven't been told, then this opens them up to making a mistake that could have been resolved with a proper handover. And these mistakes often happen when the number of users of a tool rapidly grows, or there is a large difference in technical expertise between the tool adopter and the tool proposer. So a poor handover process opens people up to several issues. Firstly, there's a risk of causing unintended harm because you don't know how to use the tool. And this fear can drive people towards using these safer but much more time-consuming alternatives. Secondly, you risk picking up a tool that was not what you expected or agreed upon at the beginning of the development stage, and this can cause delays and wasting significant funds. And lastly, research is misused because there were not clear expectations set out from the beginning. Handovers provide a real potential intervention point where governance can be applied, where you can reduce the information lost at each handover stage. And we were approached by numerous people asking us to actually step into this conversation. And we've tried addressing these handover points with a flexible framework that can be applied to any sector. Importantly, unlike the diagram I just showed you previously, handovers are not unidirectional. They can go back and forth between the same people, and one person could be handing over to multiple people of different technical expertise. So getting the language and structure of the handover right is crucial to ensure information is not lost. So any point where a tool is passed from one party to another is considered a handover point. Before getting into the crux of what the Responsible Handover Framework is, it's worth stating explicitly what we mean when we say tool adopters and tool proposers. A tool adopter is someone using the tool in some way. That could mean interacting with the tool through a web interface, such as using an API or an SDK if you're a developer, downloading and running the source code, fine-tuning a large language model to create a new tool, or really anything else. So it's important to recognize that an adopter can take many forms, and that as soon as you interact with a tool, you are adopting it. You may not even know you're adopting the tool. For example, when you search using Google, you're probably aware that you're adopting Google Search, but nowadays you're also adopting Google Gemini, which are two very different tools built in very different ways. And then the tool proposer, it can be someone who has either been developing the tool from the beginning and are handing it over to a tool adopter, or they could have been a tool adopter in a previous handover instance and are then handing over the tool to someone else. We identified biomedical research as being an area where handovers are of particular concern because of the potential clinical impact of the tools being developed, and then worked with Wellcome on creating the Responsible Handover Framework. The approach we took to create the framework took 3 steps. We identified a sector where handovers are particularly common, such as in engineering. We consulted existing frameworks and guides, such as the common ISO regulations, Turing Way, OECD, and extracted the questions from these frameworks because the questions are very familiar to people working in this space. And then we adopted questions from our data science guide and our modeling guide, which equips people with the right language to ask of data science, as those questions were developed and refined by leading data science experts and tested with members of the public. We then created a prototype framework with a list of rudimentary questions, tested these in various cases, as I mentioned initially in biomedical research, then refined the design of the framework based off this feedback. So this slide just shows the high-level sections of the Responsible Handover Framework. The framework takes a layered approach, beginning with 5 broad questions that are accessible to most people and relevant to all settings. It also contains 2 risk assessment points to help users consider what level of detail and possible yes/no questions would be appropriate in their specific area. So those 5 high-level questions are: what is the purpose of the tool? Where has the data come from? What assumptions are being made? Is the tool good enough for this use? And then what transparency, licenses, availability, and documentation needs to be included in the handover? And this is the framework in full on the left. I've zoomed out so you can see all the sections, which I will zoom into each section shortly. As I mentioned, the questions are structured into tiers, and the questions in each tier become more detailed as you proceed further down. For example, the first tier of questions ask very basic prompts about what the purpose of the tool is, and if the tool is to be introduced in different contexts. As you can see, the framework is designed in a way that allows for a scripted conversation to take place between the tool adopter and the tool proposer, so that the onus is not on only one party to send or receive the required information. It's a 2-part process. After the first tier, you have one of 2 risk assessments, which helps to establish the level of risk involved in using the tool, acting as a checkpoint or gateway. In the second tier are prompts covering what data was used to develop the tool, and if this data is likely to be biased in any way. Going back to the earlier example I gave about a tool to detect skin cancer, these questions are where the issue of a lack of data from different ethnicities would be flagged as an issue that needs to be addressed before using it. Questions in tier 3 for the tool adopter cover the assumptions in the model and what is required for the tool to work properly. While on the proposer side, the questions cover whether or not the downstream user has the necessary skill requirements to use the tool, and if any adjustments to the tool have been highlighted. In tier 4, there are questions to test the robustness of the tool, and if it's good enough to be used for the purpose clearly defined at the beginning, such as how performance is measured and if there is a process in place to fix the tool if the performance drops. After this tier is the final risk assessment in the framework, which addresses what are the potential negative outcomes if this tool is to be introduced, such as the risk of the tool having a negative impact on the environment and how these risks are going to be addressed. So this would be the final risk assessment, acting as a final gateway to make sure that the tool adopter is not taking on a tool that could have unintended consequences. And then lastly, the final tier of questions covers things such as transparency of data and the licenses and documentation that need to be filled in before using the tool. And finally, the framework ends with the tool proposer stating confidently that this is a responsible handover process that they are happy to sign off on. Importantly, not all questions will be relevant across all sectors. The questions are intended to be fully modifiable and adaptable, depending on the sector the framework's being introduced in. Some people may find that they don't need as many layers of questions that we have here, or that there are some key questions that are missing specific for their field. We don't expect the framework to be used as we've displayed it here, but to act as a basis for future guidance and governance. Similar to a health and safety form in research labs, where the layouts are very similar, but the questions vary significantly across disciplines. A COSH form which is a health and safety form in biomedical research, is going to look very different in a biochemistry lab compared to a COSH form in a facility using mice models. But the way the forms are laid out are very similar in both scenarios. Importantly, this framework is not intended to just be another bureaucratic step or rigid framework in AI governance, but as something that can really help drive innovation and boost confidence across the tool development chain, all the way to the public. It helps to think about the different types of handovers that can happen and explore a little in each detail, because I think it can be quite hard for people to imagine what a handover looks like in their particular setting. We've identified 3 particular handovers, which are the most common. You have a direct handover, a facilitated handover, and an indirect handover. A direct handover represents the most engaged form of handover, but also the most resource intensive. In a direct handover, both sides require individuals who can address the relevant questions. For a tool proposer, this could be a sales or support team, developers, or in some cases, the chief exec or product officers. While for adopters, this could be a compliant officer, procurement leads, or other similar roles. In a direct handover, both the proposers and the adopters are actively completing the framework together. And the exact method to do this could be down to both parties, but is generally synchronous. For example, sitting down together in a meeting room or working through a document together. For example, at Sense About Science, we've added the chatbot NoBot to our websites. As we knew the developer, we were able to engage in a direct handover with them, where we jointly reviewed the framework to find relevant questions and address them together. In a facilitated handover, this also involves 2 parties, but they are not actively engaged when the handover is started. Facilitated handovers are almost always started by the proposer and then completed by the adopter later on. The tool proposer identifies all the relevant questions that they need to answer and answers as many of them as possible. So in this way, facilitated handovers can actively encourage adopters to complete frameworks by anticipating the needs of the adopters. Facilitated handovers can be an initial burden on the proposer, but if completed correctly, then they can save the time and resources by answering common questions adopters may have around risks. And I'll get to an example as to a facilitated handover that we did with the genome software provider Ensemble. And then lastly, indirect handovers occur when an adopter has to do all the work, as they don't know the proposer and no facilitated handover has been created. Currently, indirect handovers represent the most common type of handover, but we hope that this will change. Realistically, indirect handovers must be completed by researching how the tool in question was developed, and this can mean looking through pages upon pages of terms and conditions, privacy policies, help pages, and any other documentation the proposer has made available. Ideally, adopters should still try and reach out to sales and supports team to support them with all relevant questions that they cannot answer themselves, but this is quite time-consuming and burdensome. For example, we worked with the Mike Hudson Foundation on a tool they created called LongSeek, whereby you can upload the terms and conditions of a tool you are looking to adopt, and it fills in the Responsible Handover Framework prompts if you upload the framework PDF on there as well. So it may feel like handing over a piece of software is time-consuming and a bit daunting, but handovers are not a new concept, and the process exists both formally and informally all around us. For example, any medication we take comes with an extremely detailed list of potential side effects and guidelines on how and when to take the medication. We would never conceive of a situation where we are giving the public a drug without addressing the potential risks. Also, other examples include things such as README files detailing how to run a piece of software, how it was developed, and any notes or version history. Whenever a piece of code is written, documenting how that code has been developed, backup procedures, and lastly, from a more easier to understand for those in the audience who are biomedical researchers, lab protocols, which when written well are extremely detailed and unambiguous. So I'm about to take you through 2 case studies just on how the responsible handover has helped tool developers and adopters. And these were done during our initial launch of the Responsible Handover Framework, but have also been expanded upon a bit more recently. So the first case study I want to introduce you to is the work we did with the clinical scientific computing team at Guy's and St Thomas Hospital, who build or buy medical software, but they also evaluate research tools to see if they are ready for clinical deployment. Before introducing software as a medical device, there are multiple regulations and guidelines that need to be followed before they get approved. And the more regulations that the tool adopters and developers are complying with, the higher technology readiness level score that you get. And this score basically just indicates to the regulators how ready the tool is to be used in clinical settings. And the regulators are looking for as high a score as possible, which gives it a higher likelihood of being deployed. Yeah, these are just some of the regulations that you need to be complying with. So what the clinical scientific computing team have developed and open sourced is a quality management system, or QMS, which is compliant with ISO 13485. And this is an international standard in medical device life cycles. The QMS is GitHub-based, so the template can be easily adapted by other teams based around the country. Despite open sourcing this quality management system, which is understandable by clinical scientific computing teams around the country, responsible tool development doesn't rely solely on people with deep technical understanding to go through the QMS or read through how to become ISO compliant. There are clinicians providing clinical data, external researchers, marketing departments trying to market the tool that's being developed, as well as funders and doctors who are using the final tool. So how do we ensure that everyone along the tool development chain is doing this in a compliant manner, even if they do not have the technical know-how to go through the quality management system? That's exactly what we've tried to do with Guy's and St Thomas. We've taken their quality management system and other common regulations that need to be followed when developing clinical devices, and then mapped them directly onto the Responsible Handover Framework. As you can see with all of these arrows that are mapping the regulations onto the framework, there is a really high degree of overlap between the regulations and the framework, around 70 to 80%. The framework is not sufficient to entirely replace the regulations listed on the left, but it gets people who may be unfamiliar with the quality management system to a position where they are able to ask and answer the relevant questions. So it's a significant enabler for people developing AI in clinical settings. So if you are coming to developing a clinical device, maybe from a non-technical background, following the Responsible Handover Framework can be considered a much easier format to ensure that you are being compliant with all these regulations, as opposed to having to get to grips with the quality management system. This is a piece of work that is ongoing with Guy's and St. Thomas, and we're hoping to have a version of the quality management system fully integrated with the Responsible Handover Framework so that it's clear what process you should follow depending on where you are in the handover process. The second case study I want to introduce you to is a facilitated handover that we worked on with the European Bioinformatics Institute, who develop Ensemble. Now, Ensemble generates and aggregates genome annotations such as genes, genomic variants, and is commonly used by biomedical researchers all around the world. What we did with Ensemble is they were particularly concerned that people were using their platform for developing clinical tools, and they did not have the proper guidance on describing where the data comes from on Ensemble and how the data should be used responsibly. We worked with Ensemble on working through the questions in the Responsible Handover Framework and whittled down the questions to those that would be most relevant to their platform. And this is just a sample of the questions that were considered relevant to them, which we were pleased to say most of the questions were relevant, and then the ones that were not relevant. And broadly speaking, it came down to the questions that were relating to running your own instance of Ensemble were considered irrelevant. We then worked with them on an empty document where, rather than the Responsible Handover Framework questions being answered in a question answer format, which is what we were familiar with, the framework became more conversational. So they were able to provide statements that would answer all of the prompts in the Responsible Handover Framework. And this suited Ensemble a lot better as the tone fit in with the existing documentation that they have, and it's what Ensemble users are familiar with. So once we were happy with the document, this was uploaded to the new Ensemble website and is ready to be used by site visitors. It encourages users to reflect on how they intend to use the data hosted by Ensemble. And the aim here is for them to be taking into account responsible handover principles further downstream of whatever tool they are developing. So to summarize what responsible handover can provide to projects, it provides clear expectations from the beginning of a project. Both parties in the handover are clear as to the uses and limitations of the tool, as well as to the technical knowledge of the person adopting the tool, as they may require extra support. It saves time by preventing tool adopters having to find critical information to how a tool works by themselves, rather than delving deep into complex terms and conditions or having several meetings with a tool proposer. There is a scripted conversation in place for them to facilitate this. Next, ethical and responsible AI development is embedded from the first development stage, rather than tools being developed and their developers realizing years down the line that they cannot introduce their tool to the market because it hasn't obtained the relevant badge or mark of approval from regulators. And finally, responsible handover ensures that tools are sustainable long-term, as people are informed how a tool could be adapted or troubleshooted for their particular field. There's a high level of duplication with regards to AI tools because people often find it a lot easier to just develop their own version of a tool rather than learning how another tool works. So following a responsible handover process improves tool adoption of existing tools. And following on from that point, responsible handover promotes the long-term usability of AI tools post-development, allowing them to be continuously adapted. It also ensures that tools are transferred with full ownership and usability, preventing them from becoming obsolete. Thirdly, for researchers working in low and no-code environments, responsible handover opens the door to them using the tools that would be previously considered unusable due to the technical complexity involved in learning how the tool works. So this upskills researchers, which is one of the feedback we received from researchers working in the African Population Health Research Centre. And then finally, the framework bridges the gap between tool adopters and tool proposers, and particularly the gap between developers and researchers. A lot of the time, tools are developed and then passed on to researchers for further training or testing, but researchers don't know how to adapt or use the tool. So the framework promotes a more formal collaboration between developers and researchers. So where do we go from here? We have the framework and case study material, but we now need to focus on actually building the infrastructure required to ensure responsible handover is a core part of responsible AI development. We're looking to turn it from a simple one-page PDF to something that can actually be operationalized. We want to create an online platform as a home for responsible handover, integrated with existing regulations, training, and sector-specific case studies so that people can create and access tailored versions of the framework. For example, if you're a nuclear engineer and want a version of the framework suitable for your field, we want that framework to have already been created, validated, and uploaded to the platform. The platform will also be a home for on-demand training if people need support on creating a tailored version of the framework if it doesn't already exist. And the case studies demonstrate how the framework has been adopted, such as the one I've shown you from Ensemble. Importantly, to get people to adopt responsible handover practices, we need to be starting from the top. And that's pushing for sector-wide policy adoption. And the 4 sectors we've identified where policymakers need to be conscious of responsible handover is research, such as those research funders who are developing AI tools, procurements, especially in government procurements, critical infrastructure, such as AI tools being used in construction, engineering, and then finally, healthcare, such as the work we're doing with Guy's and St. Thomas on rolling out a quality management system integrated with responsible handover. We need policy teams in these 4 sectors enthusiastically adopting responsible handover. And I'll just end on this slide demonstrating how this all links together and some of the organizations we are currently in discussions with about embedding responsible handover. With the way AI is being developed, it isn't sufficient to just target one sector at a time or only focus on people who already know a lot about AI. So we're following a top-down process with all stages of AI development and sectors covered. Otherwise, regulations differ, and this would only cause confusion and inadvertently cause harm as people lack the required support to use AI safely. So that brings us to the end of this talk. If you'd like to get in touch, please send us an email on the link on the screen or follow us on our social media platforms. We also update our supporters regularly on responsible handover via our mailing list. So please do sign up if you'd like to learn more. And if you have any ideas on how we could help you embed responsible handover in your sector, please also send us an email. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.